Be warned, the following contains graphic descriptions and situations not suitable to all audiences. In addition to the usual fare, this program frequently discusses manipulation, violence, death, sex, negative stereotypes, and a surprising amount of regurgitation. Listener discretion is advised. One hot summer evening in 1924, Harry Houdini trudged up 4 flights of stairs. His right leg was throbbing, making the climb excruciating. But he soldiered on, betraying not a wince. When he reached the top, he was joined by a panel of researchers, each excited to meet the occupants of the apartment at 11 Lime Street. The group was greeted at the door by a smug, dignified man who told them his wife, the famed medium Marjorie Crandon, would join them in the parlor shortly. The normally dour doctor appeared almost giddy by their presence. If all went as expected, she would soon be the winner of the group's $2,500 prize, a windfall worth almost $45,000 today. But the illusionist wondered if he was more interested in the instant status and notoriety than the cash. Neither seemed fazed by Houdini's presence. Like most of the panel, the Crandons saw this seance as just a formality. So they obliged, seating the illusionist on her left while the doctor occupied his regular position at her right. By the end of the evening, Houdini was convinced. "I've got her," he said. "All fraud. Every bit of it." I'm Jennifer Beck, and this is The Haunted Hustle. In 1923, the magazine Scientific American announced a prize of $2,500 to anyone who could provide conclusive evidence of paranormal psychic phenomena. The judging committee was comprised of some familiar names to listeners of this show: Walter Prince, Hereward Carrington, D.F. Comstock, William McDougall, and Harry Houdini. With such a lofty prize on the line, not to mention the potential prominence of being the first medium in history to do so, many around the country accepted the challenge, with a nearly identical number being dismissed and debunked. After a while, some members feared the prize would never be awarded. Or worse, that the dismissal of so many frauds only concluded that spiritualism and psychic powers didn't exist. That is, until a prominent member of the organization submitted Mina's name for consideration. Bird, the prize committee's secretary. The repulsive little researcher had kept in touch with the Crandons after the initial study, attending many of her seances and having even penned articles asserting her gifts for the magazine. Which brings us to the next bias in our tale, confirmation bias. That all too familiar urge to favor information that confirms our beliefs. We love to look for things that support the idea that we're right, don't we? It often goes hand in hand with researcher bias, which occurs when a researcher is so confident he already has an answer that he slants the entire study and often its data accordingly. Think about studies that include interviews. How something is asked is often more important than what's asked at all. Bird even took it upon himself to preemptively publish reports of their decision to investigate her, even though the committee hadn't even discussed it, as well as follow-ups justifying the non-existent decision and touting her abilities. Articles in which he described her as, quote, the wife of a professional man in comfortable circumstances, and as a, quote, woman of culture, position, and means with an apparent horror of notoriety. He also assigned her an alias, Marjorie. To protect Dr. Crandon's privacy, of course. He also tried to control the guest list, including Crandon as a de facto researcher and leaving Houdini out of the loop. Mina's official sittings began in January of 1924. Under her husband's control, the panel, minus one very important member, noted her near-perfect accomplishments, able to produce psychic phenomena at almost every sitting. But researchers thought it was too good to be true. So while they negotiated with Crandon to exert more influence over the testing methods, Bird came out with even more articles celebrating the medium and predicting a victory was well on its way. Which was news to Houdini. He wasn't even aware she was under consideration. And he approached the president of the ASPR, Charles Munn, to learn why. The legendary escape artist had always been skeptical of mediums and psychic phenomena. He'd seen too many shifty practitioners to believe it was anything more than a sham. After observing over 100 of them, including many his friend Arthur Conan Doyle swore by, he was convinced. But instead of retreating from them, Houdini confronted them, eventually earning a reputation as one of the greatest supernatural debunkers of all time. "It takes a flim-flammer to catch a flim-flammer," he once told the Los Angeles Times. And he may have been onto something. While they had yet to be defined as such, Houdini's success on stage relied on two other perception biases: observer bias and interviewer bias. Observer bias occurs when witnesses don't possess a clear understanding of what they're looking at and simply apply their own knowledge to arrive at a conclusion, flaws and all. Even if he told them, his audience had no idea as to the lengths Houdini would go to prepare for a stunt. He trained his body to dislocate joints, hold his breath for extended periods, and even regurgitate keys. These stunts, while unbelievable, were never impossible. It just seemed so in the minds of his spectators. Interviewer bias may have a familiar ring to those who remember our episode on Annie Britton. It's at the heart of the mentalist technique of cold reading and occurs when a mark subconsciously telegraphs expectations and answers. This bias is incredibly powerful, and even if they're aware of it, can be particularly challenging for researchers to avoid. Just one slip and the subject controls the board without the interviewer being any the wiser. But it was one last bias that really chapped Houdini's saddle: publication bias. When the decision about what to publish and what to bury is dictated by the writer's preferred conclusion. This was Bird in a nutshell. Houdini was floored by the articles he released under the Society's banner, calling them the worst piffle I've ever read, paralleled only by the Tommy rot written about Mrs. Guppy, who was said to have floated through the air, a plate glass window, and a solid brick wall. Honing in on the language used in his work, he accused Bird of deliberately manipulating the public and called him out for using the prestigious journal as a platform to write whatever he liked without any regard for fact. Quote, "They are fulsome, gushing reports of nothing, and to intimate that a live pigeon had been brought into the room from the outside, passing through glass or brick without making or leaving an aperture, is doing something which a magazine with such a reputation for conservativeness and accuracy as the Scientific American should avoid." He was even more outraged when he confronted Bird directly, asking him flat out if he believed this Marjorie What's-Her-Face was the real deal. Bird's answer? "Why, yes, she's genuine. She does resort to trickery at times, but I believe she's 50 or 60% genuine." Wow. So Houdini reached out to Munn and demanded to be put back on the committee, warning, quote, "If you give this award to a medium without the strictest examination, every fraudulent medium in the world will take advantage of it." He also agreed to sweeten the pot by adding $1,000 to the original award from his own pocket. In the end, Munn sided with his friend. Which brings us to the evening of July 23rd, 1924, when Houdini made his agonizing trip up 4 flights of stairs to observe her mediumship. His leg throbbed for a reason. He had wrapped a constrictive bandage around it that morning and had worn it under his trousers all day. By that night, his skin was so inflamed it seared in pain with the slightest touch. Seated at the medium's left during the seance, he was able to feel Mina slip out of her control garments and stretch her foot to ring a bell. He confirmed this the following night when she did it again. Afterwards, he reported his findings to the committee and even gave a demonstration. In spite of this, Bird titled his next piece for the Scientific American, "Marjorie Boston Medium Passes All Psychic Tests." The committee visited again in August when Mina consented to perform a seance while wearing a median control, a box into which the subject and an investigator would insert their feet, then have them secured with a locking lid. The device effectively binded them and prevented one from slipping out undetected. A bell was placed just outside the box, and the investigator held her hands. No paranormal phenomena occurred. Then Houdini subjected Mina to a control of his own, a larger box. Don't be too judgmental. The study of psychic phenomena was still in its infancy. These guys were just doing it on the fly. And he was a magician, not a mechanical engineer. Prior to the seance, he requested she step inside the contraption, slipping her head and hands through the only available openings. When Walter made his appearance, the committee asked him to ring a bell which had been placed in the box with her. He agreed, but again, no supernatural phenomena was observed. With her legs immobile, there was no table tilting or rapping, and the bell placed before her remained still. After a few minutes, the supposed specter exclaimed the bell had been tampered with and accused Houdini of sabotage. The bell was examined, and Team Mina was right. A piece of rubber was wedged inside, preventing the clapper from making contact with the side of the bell. While there was no proof Houdini was responsible, Crandon groused as another demonstration went down as a fail. Testing continued, and Mina redeemed herself 2 days later. While in that same cabinet, the bell clanked and fell over. But when the lights were turned on and the box was examined, the lid had been forced open. Houdini concluded Mina escaped and rang the bell herself. The Crandons insisted Walter was responsible. And Bird penned another story, which he headlined, "Scientists Find No Trickery in a Score of Seances." Determined to close the proverbial box, the illusionist reinforced the lid with additional staples, hasps, and 4 padlocks, and Mina again stepped inside. Prior to beginning the next seance, no doubt sick of being cooped up like a giant Happy Meal, she requested she be allowed to freely move inside. The committee agreed, and the sides of the cabinet were closed. What happened next depends on who you believe. At some point during her subsequent trance, Walter emerged and taunted the illusionist, saying, "Houdini, you are very clever indeed, but it won't work. I suppose it was an accident those things were left in the cabinet?" Houdini denied knowing what he was talking about. The cabinet was opened and a collapsible ruler was discovered beneath the floor. Houdini was delighted. Finally, he had his smoking gun. He accused the medium of using the ruler to ring the bell with her mouth and to produce the other telekinetic effects which normally would have been present. The study abruptly ended, and Houdini declared her a fraud. In response, Crandon popped his cork and accused Houdini and his assistant of planting the ruler. Both were questioned and denied it. A heated argument ensued, and Walter blurted out, "Houdini, you goddamn bastard! Get the hell out of here and never come back! If you don't, I will!" Houdini's assistant would later say he'd been instructed to place the ruler there, in case his boss couldn't find any other way to discredit her. But either way, Bird omitted the whole thing in his next article, "Boston Medium Baffles Experts." But that was about all Bird omitted. In an unusual editorial turn, his article revealed Mina's true identity, Dr. Crandon's professional resume, and the couple's standing in British society. So much for abhorring publicity. The Crandons denied any kind of involvement when the story was later picked up by the New York Times, but the timing of her doxing was suspicious to all but her most loyal supporters. At a time when ethical journalism was more of a theory than a practice, people knew it was far more likely the Crandons leaked the information, rather than it being the product of investigative journalism. Despite the lack of full agreement within the committee, Houdini took his conclusions public, publishing a tell-all amply titled, "Houdini Exposes the Tricks Used by the Boston Medium Marjorie to Win the $2,500 Prize Offered by Scientific American." He was an illusionist, remember? Not a writer. In it, he detailed his experience with the medium, the results, and how she did it, with detailed illustrations. He also laid bare his suspicions of Bird's involvement for good measure. The pamphlet was a huge blow, and the Crandons took the instant bestseller as a personal insult. The nerve of that foreigner daring to tarnish him! His wife? As if she were no better than any other run-of-the-mill medium. In January of 1925, Houdini took a victory lap in the Crandons' backyard on the stage of Boston Symphony Hall, where he performed a dramatic reproduction of many of Marjorie's phenomena. Other magicians soon jumped on the bashing bandwagon. John Booth demonstrated how Marjorie was able to produce spirit voices with a mouthful of water. The audience was stunned by its simplicity. She just swallowed, spoke, then took another drink of water just before the lights came on using a concealed test tube. The packed performances enraged the couple. The Crandons replied with a demonstration of their own at Jordan Hall, which was well received by supporters and well covered by Bird. His next article, "Houdini, the Magician Stumped," was even picked up by mainstream newspapers eager to fall in line with the New York Times. Marjorie the Medium soon became a media sensation, but it did little to sway anyone. By then, everyone seemed to move into their separate camps. When the committee wanted to resume testing in February, the Crandons refused. The doctor insisted the only way he would consider putting his wife through any more was without Houdini. When they wouldn't agree, the study was over. With Bird in tow, the Crandons quickly mobilized a public relations campaign to rebuild her brand. If they couldn't persuade people to ignore Houdini, the next best thing they figured was to drown him out and produce even more spectacular feats. Physical evidence. The ectoplasm that once emerged from her eyes, ears, and other parts suddenly took solid form. The Crandons claimed they were a baby's hand, a fully matured hand, and something else. A stick? Maybe a malformed arm? During her show, Mina invited some audience members to touch the mysterious parts themselves. Although unable to make anything out of it, many described them as dead. With her new trick perfected, the Crandons reached out to their supporters across the pond and got a bite from the British SPR. Despite less than stellar reviews from the Scientific American, Mina's mediumship, if not the included photos, attracted the attention of the research team of Doctors Dingwall, McDougall, and Elwood Worcester. When they arrived, she brought her A-game. Undressed but for a handkerchief barely serving for modesty, she sat Dingwall on her left and covered his hand with hers. Listening to the beautiful woman breathe and writhe in her seat made it a little difficult for Dingwall to maintain his objectivity. And when an otherworldly organism began to emerge from between her thighs, he could barely contain his excitement. "It is the most beautiful case of teleplasm and telekinesis with which I'm acquainted," he was later quoted as saying. But when the thrill of the evening wore off, he had a change of heart. In the light of day, the photographic evidence gathered at the time didn't warrant his earlier enthusiasm. McDougall criticized the supernatural structure as a Frankenstein combination of animal parts. while Dingwall questioned why so many phenomena originated from her baby-making region with no apparent medical consequence. But ectoplasm was old hat. Walter could do better than that. So, during later seances, 2 bowls of water would be placed before her, one containing hot water, the other cold. In the hot water, she would place a piece of dental wax. When it was softened, she would command Walter to prove his presence by pressing his thumbprint into it. The wax would then be placed in cold water to harden. In order to nip those pesky doubters in the bud, those who would undoubtedly claim there was no way to prove the prints actually belonged to Walter, Crandon would then encourage sitters to submit to having a sample of their own fingerprints taken in ink. When it was later discovered the prints in wax looked nothing like the ones of those sitting around the table, sitters were convinced. To further cement the conclusion, the Crandons later circulated a tale that the prints matched those left on a razor once owned by Walter, but failed to address how the prints would have survived all this time. Nonetheless, believers were enthralled. It was like the spirit left a calling card, but even better, and spurred another upheaval in spiritualist circles. In June 1925, at the Crandons' invitation, a committee of Harvard scholars held an elaborate investigation, during which time all 3 ectoplasmic entities appeared. Still, researchers were disappointed. The hands didn't move about the table as expected. They simply lay limp as if they were dead. And they appeared flattened, almost resembling altered gloves before they vanished. No one knew what to make of the rod. When asked if they could examine the manifestation, Mina refused. She claimed that to even touch it would risk her injury or death. They didn't want to kill her, did they? Nor would she consent to wearing tights or to be internally searched. She was a lady, after all. Never mind the fact that they had seen enough nude photos of her over the years to be able to pick her crotch out of a lineup. They also noticed the hands appeared to originate from Mina's groin and only appeared if Crandon was seated next to her and held her right hand. Was he sneaking her the items? As a surgeon, he was certainly capable of smuggling out body parts, as distasteful as it seemed. Perhaps more questionable acts were occurring in the Crandon home besides naked seances. The photographs they obtained were even more confusing, if not disappointing. While they did appear organic, researchers noticed a strong resemblance to intestinal or tracheal tissue, not muscular or dermal as expected. And while they weren't able to get any farther on identifying the mysterious third thing, when an investigator observed her retrieving the objects from her lap, they concluded she was a fake. But the book released soon after didn't look a thing like the reports. The opening of Marjorie Harvard Veritas, a study of psychics, included this statement. This little summary and record is handed to you as a juryman. It is not a plea of any kind. It is a dossier of facts. It contains a concise and vertical history of the Marjorie case, and it backed everything the Crandons claimed. But that might have been because he was one of the authors. Coincidentally, Bird came out with his own book at the same time, Marjorie the Medium, which also ignored the Harvard findings in full support of the Crandons. With his recognition and credentials, spiritualists flocked to her side. In the face of increasing sales and influence, he flooded the journal with tales of her validity while attacking naysayers for their bias and fake news. Disgusted by what he saw as a blatant move to manipulate the public, Prince resigned as the Society's research officer to establish the Boston Society for Psychical Research. A vacancy Bird happily filled. The seat gave him more power and control. Under his direction, the ASPR unabashedly championed her and buried unflattering reports with equal fervor. But there was still the matter of the prize. When it came time to deliberate, The committee seemed deadlocked at first. Houdini continued to assert Mina was a deliberate and conscious fraud, while Comstock took the less emotional position that no rigid proof had been produced. McDougal and Prince also remained unconvinced that anything supernatural was occurring, but seemed to split the issue of motivation and intent down the middle. McDougal went on record stating the activity he observed had been produced by normal means, while Prince believed her seances to be a, quote, normal and deceptive production. Only Carrington was willing to stretch his neck out for Mina, and even then, not as far as she would have liked. He acknowledged the impressions of his fellow committeemen by agreeing fraud was a possibility, but asserted she had displayed genuine phenomena as well. Not exactly an endorsement worth the price of a private laboratory. Privy to all this, Bird shockingly informed the media the committee was about to confirm her gifts and award her the prize. Reading about it while performing overseas, Houdini hit the roof. Unwilling to tolerate the shenanigans a minute longer, he left his tour and returned to headquarters to submit his vote in person and ensure the results weren't altered. The committee eventually voted not to give her the award. There was just too much evidence to ignore. When they announced their decision in the Journal's November edition, readers were confused, and Bird appeared suspicious. Mina shrugged it off, but through Walter, she raved. She cursed Houdini, predicting he would meet a swift and untimely end. The doctor merely said the magician wasn't worthy of a response and instead set to recruiting other researchers to validate their claims. With Bird's assistance, the ASPR sent another team in January 1926, consisting of psychologists Henry Clay McComas and Knight Dunlop, and physicist Robert W. Wood. They were admittedly less distinguished than the Crandons would have preferred, but beggars can't be choosers, and the couple figured the only way to combat Houdini was to win over someone with more impressive credentials. Mina fell into a trance, and in a few minutes, as if on cue, a narrow rod emerged from her lap. The mysterious wand hovered over the table, moving slowly from side to side, and picked up an object. Though warned that touching ectoplasm could result in the illness or death of the medium, a common disclaimer used by mediums for decades, Wood lightly touched it with the tip of his finger and followed it back to her mouth. Was that a knitting needle he felt, covered by layers of leather? He couldn't help but notice that neither she nor the ectoplasmic rod showed any reaction. So he took hold and dictated his findings to his assistant. Quote, "The whatchamacallit feels to me like a..." Upon hearing this, Mina shrieked and fainted. Crandon carried her out of the room and demanded the panel leave at once. In a formal complaint drafted later, he banned Wood from continuing his research, on the grounds of poor grammar. Quote, "A true scientist would have described the terminal as to its length, breadth, thickness, temperature, degree of hardness and softness, etc." The investigators later concluded that the ectoplasmic rod was an animal intestine stuffed with cotton and wire. Then those thumbprints were found to be bunk. Now, listening to Houdini more than proper Boston society, investigators revisited the remarkable remnants, this time in hopes of locating a source with a pulse. They found it. When gathering the fingerprints of all those who had previously attended one of Mina's seances, researchers noticed a striking similarity between Walter's supposed prints and those of Dr. Frederick Caldwell, de Crandon's dentist and personal friend. Police confirmed the findings, and Caldwell confessed to having provided the couple a bit of wax with his fingerprint impressed. When revealed, the Crandons maintained no comment and demoted Walter to a disembodied voice. In a last-ditch effort to salvage her reputation, the Crandons invited the psychic research couple, Joseph Banks Rhine and Louisa Rhine, to study her. In 1926, they accepted. But instead of being treated to a show, Mina kept her clothes on and offered them glasses of champagne. When she did consent to do a seance, the results were equally disappointing. They noted she utilized luminous objects during trickery and kicked a megaphone to convince them it was levitating. Poser. The resulting report was scathing, but with Bird and his allies safe in her corner, it was refused by the ASPR. So Rines took the piece to the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology, who was happy to run it. It was soon picked up by newspapers everywhere. In response to the public black eye, the Crandon's famous friends rushed to call Rine out. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle published an article in a Boston newspaper which included the quote, "J.B. Rine is an ass." But it didn't help. If anything, his endorsement only made it worse. It brought the report and its authors more attention. Rines later accepted a position at Duke University, and his continued research earned him renown as the father of parapsychology. Prince added the final nail to the coffin 8 years later when he described Mina as, quote, "the most ingenious, persistent, and fantastic complex of fraud in the history of psychic research." Not exactly the crown she'd been going for. But the greatest damage fell on the shoulders of the ASPR itself. In spite of the fact that their mission and methods ultimately succeeded, the newspaper headlines promoted by Bird were all the public saw. No one likes a loser. With their credibility tarnished and members discouraged, the group was never the same. Even more damning were Bird's revelations after a falling out with the Crandons in 1933, when he confessed he'd been approached by the couple to commit fraud. He was quoted as saying, "It seems to me of paramount importance in that it shows her, fully conscious and fully normal, in a situation where she thought she might have to choose between fraud and a blank seance, and she was willing to choose fraud." He added that he'd reported the incident years earlier, but it had been swept under the rug. Naturally, there was no record of this. I wonder why. He resigned from his post shortly after. Houdini took delight in the news and publicly rubbed it in his face the first chance he got. In 1939, Crandon passed away. Mina was devastated. His loss threw her into a deep depression from which she never recovered. But she kept up appearances as the doctor would have wished, continuing to call upon the spirit of Walter whenever she had a captive audience. Like Houdini, she took her secrets to the grave. At her deathbed, Nandor Fodor asked her how she managed to pull it off. Her response said it all. Quote, "All you psychical researchers can go to hell. Why don't you guess? You'll all be guessing for the rest of your lives." She died in her sleep on November 1st, 1941. This has been The Haunted Hustle. Thanks for listening. The Haunted Hustle is an original production of Toil and Trouble Media. Executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Erin Iris, and our music was by Kevin MacLeod, Light Saturation, and the Schizoid Nightmares. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and I really hope you do, be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. And give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Heck, give us a 5-star rating on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides too. We're not picky. And if you want to help us bring even more Toil and Trouble to the world, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for a sign. Well, It's the owl, but close enough. And as always, thanks for listening.